Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that your entire neighborhood has been ripped out of reality. Not destroyed. Not abandoned. Not buried beneath some apocalyptic wasteland. Simply removed from the world you knew and dropped somewhere it was never supposed to exist. The houses are still standing. The cars are still parked in driveways. The furniture is still inside the living rooms. The street signs still point toward streets that no longer connect to anything familiar. Everything looks almost exactly the way it did yesterday. Except the world outside has changed. The trees are wrong. The landscape is wrong. The sounds are wrong. And somewhere beyond the fences and backyards, creatures that should have disappeared millions of years ago are moving through the darkness. That is the nightmare at the center of the end of Oak Street. At first glance, the premise sounds like the setup for a conventional dinosaur survival movie. Take a family, place them in an impossible prehistoric environment, add enormous predators, and let the chase begin. It is an idea built for spectacle. You can almost see the trailer before the movie even starts: a suburban house, a trembling glass of water, a massive shadow crossing the window, and then a dinosaur stepping into a world of driveways, streetlights, and children's bicycles. But David Robert Mitchell is interested in something much stranger than that. Because the most frightening thing in the end of Oak Street is not the dinosaur. It is the disappearance of normality. The Platt family does not simply lose their protection. They lose their understanding of reality. Every assumption that made their ordinary lives feel stable suddenly becomes useless. Roads no longer lead where they should. Familiar objects no longer have their familiar purpose. The neighborhood that once represented routine becomes a prison surrounded by a wilderness that cannot be negotiated with. And that makes the movie's central question much more disturbing than, how do we survive the dinosaurs? The real question is, what happens to a family when civilization disappears? That question matters because the Platts were already struggling before Oak Street vanished. Denise Platt is surrounded by the visual evidence of a comfortable suburban life, yet emotionally she feels increasingly disconnected from it. Greg is there, but the relationship between them has accumulated the kind of distance that can hide beneath routine for years. Audrey is old enough to want independence but young enough to still need protection. Brian is still a child, carrying an innocence that makes the danger around him feel even more threatening. They are a family living together without always feeling truly connected. Then reality tears itself open. Suddenly, Denise cannot afford emotional distance. Greg cannot simply retreat into observation. Audrey cannot remain protected by the assumptions of childhood. Brian cannot understand what is happening, but he has to live through it anyway. Even Starbuck, the family dog, becomes more than an animal wandering through the story. He becomes a piece of the old world the family refuses to let disappear. And this is where Mitchell's premise becomes more interesting than its creature feature surface. The dinosaurs are frightening because they represent something humans cannot negotiate with. You cannot reason with a predator. You cannot appeal to its morality. You cannot ask it to respect your property line. You cannot tell a prehistoric animal that this used to be your backyard. The creatures simply exist. And that is exactly what makes them such effective metaphors for change. Modern life encourages us to believe that our routines are permanent. We wake up, go to work, go to school, drive the same roads, see the same people, return to the same house, and gradually mistake repetition for security. The world feels predictable because we have built systems around ourselves that make unpredictability invisible. But predictability is not permanence. The end of Oak Street takes that uncomfortable truth and makes it physical. The street is still there. The home is still there. The family is still there. But the context has disappeared. And once that happens, the audience begins looking at every ordinary suburban object differently. A mailbox becomes a marker of a world that no longer exists. A family car becomes a machine that can no longer guarantee escape. A backyard becomes the edge of an ecosystem humans were never designed to inhabit. A window becomes a boundary between the familiar and the unknowable. And a house, which once meant safety, becomes something much more complicated. It is still home. But home is no longer enough. That contradiction is what makes the film so compelling. The Platts are physically surrounded by the remnants of their old lives, yet emotionally they are further from normality than they have ever been. And somewhere beneath all the dinosaurs, all the strange lights, all the temporal questions and impossible geography, Mitchell keeps returning to one unsettling idea. What happens when the place you call home survives, but the world that gave that place meaning does not? The film never treats that question as a simple survival puzzle. Instead, it lets the uncertainty hang over the family. Why Oak Street? Why these people? Why this moment? What exactly caused the displacement? Is this time travel, some kind of cosmic accident, or something that exists outside the rules the characters understand? The more the Platts try to understand their situation, the more obvious it becomes that understanding may not be possible. And that is important, because the end of Oak Street is built around a kind of uncertainty that David Robert Mitchell has explored throughout his career. His earlier films often placed ordinary people inside situations they could not fully explain. The threat might be visible, but its rules remained uncertain. The characters could observe it, react to it, even develop strategies around it, but they could never completely reduce it to something comfortable. That sensibility remains here. Only now, instead of placing an unknown threat inside an ordinary world, Mitchell does almost the opposite. He takes an ordinary world and places it inside something unknowable. That difference is the key to understanding why the end of Oak Street feels so unusual. This is not simply Jurassic Park in a suburb. It is suburbia becoming the strange object. The dinosaur world is terrifying, but so is the realization that the familiar world was never as permanent as it appeared. And that is why Denise becomes the emotional center of the movie. Her journey is not simply about becoming better at surviving. It is about discovering what remains when all the structures that previously defined her life disappear. Because once Oak Street is gone as a safe environment, Denise has to decide what kind of person she is without the routines that once told her who she was. Is she a wife? A mother? A neighbor? A woman trapped inside a life she has grown emotionally distant from? Or can she become something defined entirely by her choices? That question quietly drives the story beneath the spectacle. The end of Oak Street may advertise dinosaurs, but its real subject is much closer to home. It is family. It is fear. It is nostalgia. It is the illusion of control. And above all, it is the frightening possibility that the world we recognize can disappear without asking permission. To understand why that idea carries so much weight, It helps to look beyond the basic premise and consider what kind of film David Robert Mitchell was attempting to make in the first place. Because the end of Oak Street arrives carrying several identities at once. It is a dinosaur movie. It is science fiction. It is family drama. It is suburban horror. It is a mystery. It is also the largest scale production of Mitchell's career, which means the movie exists at the intersection of two very different filmmaking traditions. On one side is the intimate, atmospheric cinema that established Mitchell's reputation. Films like The Myth of the American Sleepover and It Follows were not built around spectacle. Their power came from mood, uncertainty, awkwardness, isolation, and the feeling that something ordinary had become subtly wrong. On the other side is the machinery of the modern blockbuster. Big stars. Large sets. Digital creatures. Theatrical spectacle. IMAX presentation. A recognizable high-concept premise. And dinosaurs. That combination creates a fascinating tension before the story even begins. Can a filmmaker known for ambiguity and psychological unease operate inside a movie designed around giant prehistoric creatures? Can a dinosaur film resist becoming just another dinosaur film? Can a suburban family drama carry the scale of a science fiction spectacle without losing its emotional center? And perhaps most importantly, can a movie borrow the visual language of Spielbergian adventure without becoming a copy of Spielberg? Those are the questions this analysis will keep returning to. We will experience the story chronologically, because the details matter. The way Oak Street changes matters. The way the Platts respond to danger matters. The way the mystery expands matters. And the strange final movement of the story becomes much more meaningful once we understand what the family has already lost. But the story itself is only the beginning. Because after following the Platts through their impossible journey, we can start asking why Denise changes the way she does, why Greg struggles to find his role, why Audrey responds to danger differently from her parents, and why Brian's vulnerability becomes such an important emotional pressure point. We can examine the dinosaurs not simply as monsters, but as forces that expose human weakness. We can look at Oak Street itself as a symbolic object. We can examine how familiar houses and suburban architecture become uncanny when surrounded by prehistoric wilderness. We can explore the movie's obsession with time, identity, and the human need to explain things that may not have explanations. And then there is the filmmaking. Mitchell's movement from independent horror to a much larger studio production is one of the most interesting parts of the project. The movie gives him access to scale, but he does not suddenly abandon the instincts that made his earlier work distinctive. There are moments when the camera watches instead of rushing. Moments when silence becomes more frightening than music. Moments when the audience sees only part of a creature rather than the entire animal. Moments when the environment itself seems to be looking back at the characters. Michael Giacchino's score adds another layer to that tension, because his musical language naturally carries associations with adventure, science fiction, wonder, and family spectacle. But here, those familiar sounds are placed inside a movie that is less comfortable than the adventures they evoke. Then there is the reception. Some viewers respond to the movie as an inventive creature feature. Others want more answers. Some appreciate the ambiguity. Others see it as an excuse for unresolved storytelling. Both reactions can be valid. A movie can intentionally refuse to explain something and still leave an audience unsatisfied. And a movie can leave questions unanswered precisely because those questions are part of its meaning. The interesting conversation begins when we stop treating those positions as mutually exclusive. The same tension applies to the movie's commercial future and cultural legacy. An original dinosaur film arriving outside an established franchise carries a different kind of risk. The audience knows what a dinosaur movie is supposed to look like, but the end of Oak Street is asking them to accept something stranger. It wants the wonder of a creature adventure without giving up the discomfort of psychological mystery. It wants nostalgia without allowing nostalgia to become comforting. It wants the audience to look at a familiar street and realize that familiarity itself can be frightening. And that is why this film begins in such an ordinary place. Because the more ordinary Oak Street feels, the more terrifying its disappearance becomes. Think about the streets you remember from childhood. Maybe it was the road outside your grandparents' house. Maybe it was the neighborhood where you learned to ride a bicycle. Maybe it was a driveway where your family car always sat. Maybe it was a particular tree, a fence, a mailbox, a corner shop. Or the house of a neighbor whose name you have not heard in 20 years. Most people do not remember these things because they were extraordinary. They remember them because they were repeated. The same road. The same house. The same bedroom. The same route home. There is something deeply human about that repetition. Childhood especially creates the illusion that familiar places will always be there. A house feels permanent because, from a child's perspective, it has existed for as long as memory can reach. The end of Oak Street takes that emotional assumption and attacks it directly. The neighborhood does not become dangerous because it was always dangerous. It becomes dangerous because the rules surrounding it change. That is why the suburban setting matters so much. If the movie began in an isolated jungle, the audience would already expect danger. If it began on an alien planet, uncertainty would be part of the premise. But a suburban street carries an entirely different emotional contract. A suburban neighborhood promises normality. It promises that the world can be understood. There are houses with boundaries. Roads with directions. Cars with keys. Doors with locks. Families with routines. Even danger is usually categorized. A broken window is an accident. A storm is weather. A strange noise is probably an animal. You can explain these things. But when a dinosaur walks past the house, the entire system collapses. The street has become something the characters cannot categorize. And for an audience raised on dinosaur movies, there is another layer. Dinosaurs are already part of childhood imagination. For many people, dinosaurs begin as toys, drawings, books, museum skeletons, plastic figures, and bedroom decorations. They are creatures associated with wonder long before they become associated with fear. That makes their appearance in the end of Oak Street emotionally complicated. The child sees the impossible and may initially see wonder. The adult sees the same creature and sees mortality. That contrast is built into the concept. A dinosaur can be the most exciting thing a child has ever seen and the most terrifying thing an adult can imagine standing outside the kitchen window. And that difference reflects the larger generational tension inside the Platt family. Brian still occupies a world where the impossible can feel magical. Audrey is caught between childhood and adulthood. Denise and Greg understand what the family stands to lose. The prehistoric world does not merely threaten their bodies. It forces each generation to confront uncertainty differently. That is one reason the film's 1980s setting matters. It is not simply a costume choice. The period allows Mitchell to work with a cultural image of suburbia that audiences already associate with family entertainment, childhood adventure, and nostalgia. The colors, clothes, cars, houses, music, and domestic spaces can all initially feel reassuring. But nostalgia becomes much less comfortable when the thing being remembered is placed inside a world that no longer belongs to it. The result is almost like watching a childhood memory become a survival nightmare. And that is where the movie can surprise viewers who think they already understand its premise. Because if you approach the end of Oak Street expecting dinosaurs, you will find dinosaurs. But if you pay attention to what the movie does with the family, the street, the house, and the concept of returning home, the story begins to look very different. The dinosaurs stop being the destination. They become the pressure. The pressure that forces the family to reveal what was already broken. The pressure that turns emotional distance into physical danger. The pressure that makes every familiar object suddenly meaningful. And eventually, the pressure that forces the characters to decide what home actually means. That idea becomes even more interesting when we consider how Mitchell arrived at this unusually large project. David Robert Mitchell did not begin his career making films built around giant creatures and expensive visual effects. His early work came from a much smaller filmmaking tradition. The myth of the American sleepover established an interest in adolescence, social uncertainty, and the strange emotional atmosphere surrounding ordinary nights. It was intimate and low budget, but even there, Mitchell showed an ability to turn familiar environments into spaces charged with possibility. Then came It Follows. That film changed the scale of his reputation while remaining remarkably simple at its core. A young woman is pursued by a threat whose rules are disturbing precisely because they are understandable enough to fear but strange enough to never become completely comfortable. The horror is not simply the thing chasing her. It is the idea that the threat can appear anywhere. A street. A house. A school. A familiar room. Mitchell's camera often allowed ordinary spaces to breathe long enough for the audience to begin questioning them. That sensibility is crucial to the end of Oak Street. Because when you place dinosaurs inside suburbia, you could easily make the movie entirely about spectacle. Mitchell instead has another option. He can make suburbia itself uncanny. That is the opportunity created by the premise. The houses do not have to change dramatically. The context only has to change. A driveway becomes a hiding place. A backyard becomes exposed territory. A street becomes a corridor through a prehistoric ecosystem. A bedroom becomes a temporary shelter. The transformation is psychological as much as physical. That approach fits Mitchell's earlier interests far better than the phrase dinosaur movie might suggest. The project's development through Warner Brothers and Bad Robot also matters because it placed Mitchell within a much larger industrial system. J.J. Abrams and Hannah Minghella involvement helped connect the film to a studio tradition built around high-concept mysteries and large-scale genre storytelling. And Hathaway became attached early, giving the project a major star capable of carrying both intimate family drama and blockbuster spectacle. Oscar Isaac was reportedly associated with the project before Ewan McGregor ultimately joined as Greg, creating another interesting contrast between the film's original development and its final identity. The eventual ensemble, including Maisie Stella and Christian Convery, gave the family a generational structure that allowed the film to explore crisis from several different perspectives. Jordan Alexa Davis expanded the story beyond the immediate Platt family, particularly as the mystery around Oak Street became more complicated. Even the title evolved. The project was once known as Flowervale Street before becoming the end of Oak Street. That change is more than a branding footnote. Flowervale Street sounds like a location. The end of Oak Street sounds like an event. The first suggests a place. The second suggests finality. And that distinction fits the movie surprisingly well. The story is not simply about a street that becomes strange. It is about the apparent end of the world that street represented. Oak Street is a boundary between a familiar life and an unknowable one. Once the street reaches its end, the characters are forced beyond the emotional geography that previously defined them. The production itself also had to reconcile different filmmaking demands. Filming took place across London and Atlanta, while Michael Jalakis handled cinematography and Maya Shimaguchi worked on production design. John Axelrod edited the film, Aaron Bannock designed the costumes, and Michael Giacchino came aboard to shape its musical identity. Those names matter because the movie's world has to function on several levels simultaneously. It has to look like a believable 1980s suburb. It has to look like a believable prehistoric environment. And it has to make those two visual realities occupy the same physical space. That is not a simple visual effects problem. It is a storytelling problem. If the suburb looks artificial, the emotional premise collapses. If the dinosaurs look disconnected from the environment, the danger feels weightless. If the family drama is overwhelmed by spectacle, the movie becomes generic. And if the mystery becomes too dominant, the dinosaurs risk becoming decorative. The entire project depends on balance. That balance also shaped the expectations surrounding the film before audiences ever entered the theater. Mitchell had been away from filmmaking for an extended period, which naturally created curiosity among viewers who remembered It Follows and Under the Silver Lake. But the new premise introduced another kind of anticipation. An original dinosaur movie. Not another Jurassic sequel. Not another established creature franchise. An entirely new story built around the basic idea that dinosaurs have returned to the world. That alone is difficult to sell. Dinosaurs are among the most recognizable creatures in cinema. The visual language has been established for decades. Audiences know what it feels like to watch a giant predator approach a group of people. They know the rhythm of the chase. They know the sound of the roar. They know the image of humans standing beneath something enormous. So the movie had to offer another reason to care. Its answer was Oak Street. The trailers could show houses. They could show the strange phenomenon. They could show fragments of prehistoric creatures. They could show a family running. But the mystery could remain protected. Why has this happened? What rules govern the displacement? Can the family return? And if they can return, will returning actually restore what they lost? That uncertainty becomes part of the marketing itself. The audience enters expecting one kind of dinosaur story and discovers another. This is where comparisons with Jurassic Park become unavoidable but also somewhat misleading. Jurassic Park established a powerful formula: wonder, scientific hubris, chaos, suspense, and survival. Its dinosaurs were both spectacular and terrifying. The end of Oak Street inherits some of that sense of wonder, but Mitchell's interests are different. Spielberg often asks what happens when humans encounter something extraordinary and rediscover their capacity for awe. Mitchell asks what happens when humans encounter something extraordinary and realize their emotional foundations are unstable. The distinction may seem small. It is not. One approach is built around wonder becoming adventure. The other is built around wonder becoming alienation. And that difference explains why some viewers will leave the theater exhilarated while others may leave unsettled. The film does not always provide the clean satisfaction of conventional blockbuster storytelling. Instead, it repeatedly asks the audience to live with uncertainty. Before we can decide whether that works, however, we have to understand what the plots actually experience. Because the emotional power of the mystery depends on what the family loses when Oak Street disappears. The movie begins by giving us normality. And normality, in this case, is not boring. It is the thing the characters are about to miss. The 1980s suburban setting introduces Denise Platt inside a world that looks comfortable from the outside. The house has the familiar visual language of domestic stability. There are rooms with specific purposes. There are objects that belong where they are supposed to belong. There is a street outside that connects the house to other homes. And there is a family living inside that structure. But emotional stability is not quite the same thing as physical stability. Denise already feels the weight of a life that has become repetitive. She is surrounded by people she loves, yet the emotional connection she wants is not always available to her. Greg's presence is complicated by the distance between them. Their marriage is not presented as a simple disaster. That would be easier. Instead, there is the more recognizable problem of two people who have accumulated enough history to remain together while still failing to communicate what they actually need. Audrey occupies another kind of distance. She is a teenager. She wants autonomy. She wants to be taken seriously. And like many teenagers, she can interpret parental concern as interference even when that concern comes from love. Brian is younger, more dependent, and less equipped to understand the emotional tension around him. Then there is Starbuck. The dog is part of the family's everyday rhythm. He belongs to the world before the disaster. And because animals cannot understand the larger situation in the same way humans do, Starbuck also becomes a reminder of what the family is trying to protect. Before anything supernatural happens, these relationships establish the emotional landscape. The family is together. But togetherness is not the same as unity. That distinction becomes crucial once the impossible event occurs. The early signs are subtle. The environment begins behaving incorrectly. Lights appear where they should not. There are strange inconsistencies in the world. The characters do not immediately know what to call them. That matters because horror often becomes less frightening once the characters understand its rules. Mitchell delays that comfort. The audience notices something is wrong before the characters fully comprehend it. The result is a gradual shift from ordinary suburban observation into cosmic uncertainty. The phenomenon arrives not as a neatly explained scientific event, but as a rupture. Oak Street is displaced. The family is displaced with it. And for a moment, the most terrifying thing is not what they see. It is what they do not see. The familiar world is gone. The roads no longer provide reassurance. The horizon no longer means what it used to mean. The neighborhood exists, but its relationship to the outside world has been severed. That is the first real horror. The family looks outward and realizes that the map in their heads has become useless. They are still standing in the same physical neighborhood. But geographically, emotionally, and existentially, they are nowhere. Then they notice the landscape. It is not simply an unfamiliar place. It is an impossible place. The vegetation feels different. The atmosphere feels different. The scale feels different. And eventually, the first evidence of prehistoric life removes the last possibility that this is some ordinary disaster. The family is not lost. They are displaced. There is a difference. If you are lost, there is somewhere you can return to. If you are displaced, the question becomes whether the place you came from still exists in a form you can reach. That distinction hangs over everything that follows. Denise responds first as a mother. Her instinct is not to solve the cosmic mystery. It is to protect the family. She starts thinking about food, water, shelter, communication, and safety. Greg wants to understand the situation. His instinct is analytical. If there is a cause, perhaps there is a mechanism. If there is a mechanism, perhaps there is a way back. Audrey responds differently. Skepticism becomes a kind of defense. She does not want to surrender control psychologically. So she tries to interpret events through the attitude of someone who has not yet accepted that the rules have changed. Brian simply experiences the danger as danger. He does not need a theory to understand that the world outside has become frightening. This creates a family dynamic in which every person is reacting to the same disaster through a different emotional language. Denise acts. Greg analyzes. Audrey resists. Brian depends. And Starbuck simply tries to stay with them. The first serious dinosaur encounter changes the scale of the problem. Until that moment, the family can still imagine that the environment might be dangerous in some conventional way. A storm can be survived. An earthquake can be endured. A strange landscape can be explored. But dinosaurs introduce an enemy that belongs to an entirely different biological history. The family has entered an ecosystem where humans are not at the top of the food chain. That realization is more important than any single creature. They are no longer living in a world designed around human needs. There are no convenient roads. No emergency services. No reliable communication. No assumption that darkness means bedtime rather than hunting time. The family begins learning rules. Do not move carelessly. Do not assume an open space is safe. Do not confuse quiet with peace. Do not treat familiar architecture as protection. And do not separate from the group unless you have no other choice. That last rule becomes particularly painful because the family has already been emotionally separated long before the physical disaster. Now they have to learn how to stay together. The introduction of Jeanette expands that pressure. She is an outsider, but her presence changes the survival equation. The Platts can no longer think only in terms of their private family unit. They have entered a larger problem. Other people may have been displaced. Other people may need help. And other people may carry knowledge the family does not possess. The story begins moving away from the simple idea of one family versus dinosaurs and towards something more complicated. A community has been broken apart. And the survivors have to decide what remains when the infrastructure connecting them disappears. This is where the film's domestic objects become increasingly strange. A kitchen utensil can become a tool. A vehicle can become shelter. A fence can become a defensive barrier. A backyard can become a dangerous passage. The objects are unchanged. Their meaning has changed. That is one of Mitchell's most effective ideas. A suburban house is not inherently safe. It is safe because civilization surrounds it. Remove civilization, and the same house becomes a structure in the wilderness. The family gradually understands this. And the more they explore the altered neighborhood, the more they recognize that the disaster has not simply moved them somewhere else. It has rewritten the meaning of where they already were. Every dinosaur encounter reinforces that idea. The creatures behave according to their own instincts. Some are predators. Others are simply environmental threats. Not every danger is an enemy. Sometimes the environment itself is dangerous because humans do not understand it. This distinction helps the film avoid turning its creatures into cartoon villains. The dinosaurs are not evil. They do not hate the Platts. They do not understand the concept of Oak Street. They are simply living. And that makes them more frightening. A villain can be defeated. An ecosystem cannot. You can kill a predator that attacks you. You cannot kill the entire concept of nature. The family therefore has to adapt rather than conquer. That is a major shift from the fantasy of modern control. In the world they came from, humans had built systems that allowed them to feel powerful. Now those systems are gone. The family has to rediscover vulnerability. And vulnerability changes relationships. Denise becomes more willing to take risks because waiting for someone else to solve the problem is no longer possible. Greg's analytical approach becomes less detached. Audrey begins demonstrating abilities she did not know she possessed. Brian's vulnerability becomes a source of courage rather than simply weakness. Jeanette becomes increasingly important because she offers another perspective on the situation. And Starbuck's separation becomes an emotional crisis all by itself. Because the dog represents something absurdly small compared with the cosmic disaster. The universe has broken. Dinosaurs are roaming the neighborhood. Time itself may be unstable. And yet the family still worries about one dog. That is not a distraction from the story. It is the point. Human beings do not measure catastrophe according to cosmic scale. We measure it through relationships. A world can end, and the thing that makes us cry might still be a missing dog. That is why Starbuck matters. He gives the audience something simple to care about inside a story full of impossible questions. As the dangers increase, the family starts making mistakes. They misjudge the environment. They underestimate creatures. They argue. They split up. They assume that because one area was safe yesterday, it will be safe today. But the prehistoric world does not care about yesterday. The rules are not stable because the characters are not simply traveling through space. They are living inside a disruption of time itself. Eventually, the story begins suggesting that Oak Street's displacement may be more than a strange geographical event. Evidence points toward temporal displacement. The wormhole or cosmic phenomenon becomes central to the mystery. And suddenly the family has another problem. Maybe the question is not simply where they are. Maybe it is when they are. That distinction transforms the story. Space can be navigated. Time cannot be walked back through like a road. The family begins considering the possibility that they have been pushed into another period of Earth's history. But that possibility creates an even stranger question. If they return, what exactly will they return to? The world they left may still exist. But what if their disappearance has consequences? What if the displaced timeline continues without them? What happens to people who remain there? What happens when a person intersects with another version of their own existence? These questions begin pushing the movie away from survival adventure and toward temporal mystery. The family finds evidence suggesting that the displacement is not random in the simple sense. Oak Street matters. Its location matters. The event may have occurred because of a particular intersection between place, time, and the strange phenomenon. The movie does not hand the audience a complete scientific explanation. Instead, it provides fragments. That is deliberate. Mitchell wants the audience to experience uncertainty alongside the characters. There is a false sense of hope when a potential path back appears. For a moment, the family can imagine that the nightmare has an exit. But the exit is not simple. There are obstacles. There are creatures. There are separations. There is the possibility of losing Brian. There is the possibility of losing Audrey. There is the uncertainty surrounding Starbuck. And Denise reaches the emotional point that the movie has been quietly building toward. She cannot protect everyone. That is perhaps the most painful realization for a parent. A parent can prepare. A parent can sacrifice. A parent can fight. But a parent cannot control every outcome. The prehistoric world makes that truth impossible to ignore. Greg responds to the crisis differently. His evolution is not about becoming a warrior. It is about becoming emotionally present. The old habits that allowed him to maintain distance are less useful when every decision can mean life or death. He has to participate. He has to trust Denise. And Denise has to trust other people. This is where the family story becomes inseparable from the survival story. The characters cannot survive physically without changing emotionally. And the temporal mystery cannot be solved without confronting the emotional consequences of returning home. The midpoint therefore becomes a crisis of choice. Survival is no longer enough. They need to decide what they are willing to risk to get back. That decision leads directly into the final movement of the story. The family begins preparing a plan. For perhaps the first time, they are not reacting individually. They are acting together. Denise takes responsibility. Greg contributes instead of observing. Audrey's independence becomes useful rather than oppositional. Brian finds courage in the middle of fear. Jeanette becomes essential to understanding the escape. And Starbuck, whose presence has represented home throughout the story, becomes part of the emotional equation. The final confrontation with prehistoric danger is therefore not simply a battle against dinosaurs. It is the physical expression of everything the family has been learning. They cannot control the world, but they can choose how they respond to it. They cannot eliminate uncertainty, but they can move through it together. The wormhole or temporal mechanism offers a possible way back. And the return itself contains one of the movie's strangest ideas. The family comes back to their original timeline only minutes after disappearing. That creates a bizarre emotional effect. From the outside, almost no time has passed. From the family's perspective, they have lived through an enormous psychological and physical ordeal. The world they return to is almost exactly the world they remember. But they are not the same people. That is the important part. The house is still there. The street is still there. The ordinary life is still there. But the people inside that life have changed. And then the story introduces its strangest complication. Jeanette exists in two forms. The temporal implications are deliberately unsettling. If two versions of the same person can exist, then the movie's ideas about identity become much larger than the survival premise. What makes someone the same person? Memory? Experience? Continuity? Location? If two versions of a person live through different histories, are they still one person? Or are they now two individuals who simply began from the same origin? The movie refuses to close that question neatly. Instead, it returns the characters to normality. There is a family barbecue. The ordinary world resumes. People eat. They talk. The environment looks familiar. And that normality is almost stranger than the dinosaurs. Because the audience knows what happened. The characters know what happened. But the world around them does not care. This is where the film's ending becomes connected to its central theme. Home is not simply a geographical location. Home is the people who survive the impossible with you. The Platts do not return unchanged. Their experience remains inside them. The street looks the same. But it no longer means exactly the same thing. That is the emotional resolution. The mystery remains partially unresolved because the movie is less interested in explaining the universe than in showing how people respond when the universe stops making sense. That choice will divide viewers. Some will see the unanswered questions as frustrating. Others will see them as the natural conclusion to a story about uncertainty. And both reactions are understandable. But to judge the ending fairly, we have to understand what Denise has become by the time she reaches it. Denise begins the story trapped inside a version of adulthood that feels increasingly passive. Her life is structured. Her responsibilities are clear. She loves her family. But love and connection are not always the same thing. The disaster strips away every distraction. There are no social expectations left. No ordinary schedule. No comfortable routines. No opportunity to postpone difficult conversations indefinitely. There is only the next decision. Protect Brian. Find Audrey. Work with Greg. Help Jeanette. Find Starbuck. Find a way home. The prehistoric world gives Denise something her suburban life could not. Clarity. Not comfort. Clarity. She knows what matters because everything else has disappeared. That is why her transformation works as more than a conventional action arc. She does not become heroic because she suddenly discovers she enjoys danger. She becomes active because passivity is no longer possible. The old world gave her enough structure to remain uncertain. The new world forces her to choose. And Hathaway's performance is important here because Denise is not played as a superhero. Her physicality changes under pressure. Her body becomes more alert. Her movements become more decisive. But the emotional performance remains restrained. Fear is often present beneath the action. She is not fearless. She is afraid and acts anyway. That distinction makes her more believable. In domestic scenes, Hathaway can communicate the weight of small frustrations. A glance. A pause. A moment of hesitation. A silence between husband and wife. Then, when the world collapses, those same emotional details gain new meaning. The woman who once seemed frustrated by ordinary life suddenly becomes the person everyone depends upon. The environment has not created her strength from nothing. It has revealed strength that was already there. Her relationship with Greg is particularly important. Their marriage represents one of the film's quieter questions. What happens when two people who have learned to coexist are suddenly forced to truly depend upon each other? Survival does not automatically repair a relationship. In fact, extreme circumstances can expose every weakness. But the crisis gives Denise and Greg a chance to stop performing their ordinary roles and start making real choices together. Greg's transformation works in parallel. He begins with the desire to understand. That instinct is useful. But eventually, he has to accept that understanding may not come before action. He cannot wait for perfect information. No one has perfect information in a prehistoric wilderness. The film therefore creates a subtle conflict between analysis and responsibility. Sometimes you need an explanation. Sometimes you need to move. Audrey embodies another version of that tension. Teenagers often experience adulthood as a structure that limits them. Parents say no. Parents worry. Parents overreact. Parents assume they know better. But when the world genuinely becomes dangerous, Audrey discovers that independence has consequences. She is capable. She is intelligent. She can contribute. But capability does not eliminate fear. Her growth comes from learning that independence does not mean isolation. She can become stronger without rejecting the people who love her. Brian provides the opposite emotional perspective. He is still young enough to depend on others. The world does not become less frightening simply because he cannot understand it. That makes his courage meaningful. Courage is not the absence of fear. For Brian, courage means continuing to move even when the adults around him cannot promise that everything will be okay. Jeanette broadens the emotional architecture further. She begins outside the family. But shared danger creates connection. Her importance grows because the survival problem eventually becomes inseparable from the temporal mystery. She knows things the Platts do not. She also has her own relationship to the strange phenomenon. By the ending, her existence becomes part of the movie's biggest philosophical question. And then there is Starbuck. Starbuck may be the simplest character in the movie, but that simplicity is exactly why the dog matters. He does not need a theory. He does not need to understand time. He does not need to interpret the wormhole. He simply wants to stay with his family. In a film where humans become obsessed with explaining reality, the dog represents uncomplicated attachment. That is why his disappearance carries such emotional weight. And when he returns, the relief feels disproportionate to the cosmic scale of the story. But emotionally, it is not disproportionate at all. The family has been fighting for pieces of home. Starbuck is one of those pieces. The movie's antagonism works because there is no single villain. There is no mastermind hiding behind the dinosaurs. There is no evil scientist controlling the wormhole. There is no human enemy who can be defeated and blamed. Instead, the plots face layers of opposition. Dinosaurs. Environment. Time. Isolation. Fear. Family dysfunction. And the unknown. That is a much more unusual form of antagonism. A conventional villain has intention. The forces in the end of Oak Street often do not. The dinosaur does not care about the family's emotional journey. The landscape does not care about their marriage. Time does not care whether Denise is ready to say goodbye. The universe does not owe them an explanation. That indifference creates the movie's deepest philosophical tension. Humans desperately want events to mean something. We search for causes. We look for patterns. We want someone responsible. But nature does not necessarily operate according to human ideas of fairness. A predator is not evil because it hunts. A storm is not cruel because it destroys a house. A cosmic event does not need a moral reason. The characters are forced to confront a universe that does not recognize their emotional importance. And that is frightening because modern civilization allows us to forget how vulnerable we are. Technology gives us information. Infrastructure gives us mobility. Medicine gives us protection. Architecture gives us shelter. Communication gives us connection. We gradually build layers between ourselves and uncertainty. The prehistoric world removes those layers. Suddenly, a human body is just a human body. A house is just a structure. A car is just a machine. And the family has to survive without the invisible systems that normally make those things feel powerful. This is why the dinosaurs function so well as thematic antagonists. They are not metaphors in the simplistic sense that each dinosaur represents one specific emotion. They are more like environmental pressure. They force the characters to confront reality without the protections they have become accustomed to. The unknown is therefore the movie's ultimate antagonist. Fear becomes stronger when you do not know the rules. Panic grows when you cannot predict the next event. Isolation becomes dangerous because humans are social creatures. Family dysfunction becomes an internal threat because survival requires trust. The film's antagonism is therefore distributed across the entire experience. Nothing has to hate the Platts.